So I want to talk a bit today about how we can try and establish boundaries in what's increasingly becoming a 24/7 culture. And by that, I'm very much referring to the fact that with email, instant messaging and a whole host of technology, so many of us now are accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for some of us to step out of that. So we thought it would be a really helpful wellbeing topic to think about some of the boundaries we can put in place to protect ourselves a little bit. So when I talk about boundaries, I came across this really powerful quote, and I think this applies to all aspects of our life, not just our work life. And that is, what you allow, you encourage. And this very much is explaining that how we engage with others and what boundaries we choose to establish is providing the people who are in our lives, be that work or home, as what they can do and can't do to us, and how they communicate with us. So whatever we allow somebody to do, that we allow to go unchallenged if it causes us distress or anxiety or a whole host of other things, we're almost condoning and encouraging that behaviour if we haven't addressed it and put in a boundary. So in terms of setting boundaries, we're simply referring to the means by which we define and communicate personal practices for ourselves that are healthy, compassionate and respectful. And these boundaries that we're able to define and communicate allow us and others to completely understand what is acceptable in terms of our actions towards us, and allows us to navigate our own lives more effectively. If we know what we expect from others very clearly, then when something goes against that, it's very quickly recognisable. And when we think about how we do that at work, setting boundaries at work simply means that we are defining and communicating the professional practices for ourselves that are healthy, compassionate and respectful, and that those will allow us to separate our work and our personal life more effectively. And it's really helpful that we do that, because professional boundaries is not about us trying to look for ways to do less work than our fair share. It's not an indication that we aren't ambitious, that we're not keen and engaged in what we're doing. Setting work boundaries are not about having an inflexible attitude towards our work either. They're very much a protective factor. And I mean, when we think about all other aspects of our lives, boundaries are pretty much there everywhere we go, whether we are overtly aware that we're setting them or not. So thinking about extrapolating what's important to us in our personal lives into our professional lives in the form of boundaries is just the next step, really. And increasingly, I would argue, the importance of work boundaries is now more pertinent than ever. There is a whole host of factors with regards to COVID and how some of our working from home and hybrid working models have changed. And again, this increasing amount of technology that is changing our work practices means that we are very, very accessible. So it's very important to have boundaries at work to ensure that we can maintain this healthy work-life balance. And this should also allow us to raise our work satisfaction, the greater boundaries in place, and the difference between home and work life. And setting boundaries involves us establishing our own personal goals and limits that we share with others around us, that we share with our colleagues, that we share with our managers, we share with anyone who we're going to be coming into contact with. And certainly, professionally, I'm a psychologist, but I work with a lot of individuals and many other types of professions who all use boundaries with their service users at the very heart of what they do, because of the benefits that are very evident. In terms of employee benefits, work boundaries have been shown to be effective in actually raising productivity, because if we have good boundaries at work, we know what we can focus on. We can focus on our own tasks, and we're more likely to get pulled into workplace distractions if we're very boundaried about how we are acting. Good work boundaries have also been shown to be effective at managing work-related stress. A lot of the stress that many of us experience at work is often because of different expectations we might have, and our colleagues might have. And if we have already got into place these really well-defined strategies, we're able to manage many workplace issues before they've even come up, because the boundaries are already there and established. Workplace boundaries can also be really beneficial in helping us maintain a more reasonable workload, by if we've got a boundary in place about what is acceptable to us in terms of our workload, we're in a position straight away to notice when that's being exceeded, and we can raise that as it happens. It can also, for all of those reasons, it makes sense if you've got lower stress, your workload is more manageable, your risk of burnout is likely to reduce if you are able to implement and maintain workplace boundaries. And finally, in terms of the importance, being able to model an appropriate work culture is likely to lead to a much happier and healthier work culture within the workplace. And so this is why it's imperative that we all try and incorporate workplace boundaries. And you will find that when one person in a team starts employing some boundaries, there can be almost a domino effect. And some of it might be, well, if they're not doing that, I'm not doing that. But again, it's if that's out of a recognition that doing additional things is detrimental to health and the workforce, then these are the conversations that do need to be had, and hopefully that will filter out. So it can be quite nebulous a topic to talk about boundaries, because they're personal to everyone, and they may differ, but we can differentiate between different types of boundaries that may exist, and I've provided some examples here to hopefully make it a bit more explicit. So we can certainly talk about, and I think most of us will be aware of, physical boundaries. And these often relate to our workspace and our body. So most of us will be very aware of when somebody encroaches on our personal space, or touches us without permission, for example. And that can be perceived as crossing a physical boundary. So some of the physical boundaries that we might want to put in place at work is insisting that people, if touching, are shaking hands rather than hugging. And personally, I've had to navigate this a lot. I've worked in adult learning disability services for a very long time, and certainly a lot of the individuals I work with have got a lot of difficulty in understanding social norms and social cues. So a lot of people go to hug me. But, for me, that's crossing a boundary and makes it more confusing for the individual as to whether I'm a therapist or a friend. So I will always address that and advise the person shake my hand. Now, another physical boundary example could be, I have colleagues that will wear headphones when they are in a open plan office, and that is very much signalling to others, I'm busy, I'm in my own space, and at the moment I don't want to be disturbed. So that could be another example of a physical boundary. Choosing to go for lunch on your own or going for a walk on your own at lunchtime could be a way for somebody to implement a physical boundary about needing some personal time, some headspace. Specifying how long somebody can borrow something from you, how long somebody can use your computer with their own login, I hasten to add. And those are all the kind of examples really of physical boundaries that we might want to consider in terms of our working environment. And then we think about emotional boundaries. And as I'm sure, I certainly know I have, many of us will have experienced times at work when it's really difficult to start to separate out how we're feeling from that of how somebody else is feeling, particularly if you're in a team that have worked closely for many years. And somebody will come in and it'll be like, oh, this is an awful day and this has happened. And there's that balance there between empathizing and taking on and engaging and perpetuating, colluding with somebody else's bad mood. So allowing us to have our own emotional boundaries allows us to, again, put some separation in there. So we might want to actively avoid spending time with people who are vocalizing what a bad mood they're in or a particular issue with another member of staff they have, obviously unless that's your role to listen and address that. But that would be a different process than being in a bad mood. And delegating work appropriately is a very clear emotional boundary to put in. So again, I think one of the things that's difficult for many of us now is the people and myself included that I come across are all feeling very, very overwhelmed by a lot of the work tasks that we're given. And I've certainly come across people trying to do everything themselves because they don't want to feel bad about delegating appropriately to others. But again, that's an example of not putting in an appropriate boundary, which is likely to have unhealthy consequences. And another example of an emotional boundary would be having very clear conversations with managers about how we prefer to receive feedback. It's about expressing what works for us in a way that's going to benefit the overall environment that we're in. And I will talk a little later about how boundaries are often misconstrued as punitive. Actually, it should be the opposite. It's to allow easy and clear and well-defined communication and maintain the health of the workforce. So as well as our physical and emotional boundaries. We've also got mental boundaries, and these are about what we do perhaps to support our mental energy and enable us to focus on what we want to focus on when working. And mental boundaries typically relate to, you know, our opinions, our work values, and these may be boundaries we implement very much about the set hours we work. Now, again, I'm increasingly coming up against a whole host of emails that arrive that are dated Sunday at 3 a.m. or whatever. And I think, you know, these are things that we to some extent have quite a lot of control over, and whilst we might notice a pull to respond to emails and do things outside of our structured and designated hours, I think we need to take much more personal responsibility in holding that boundary ourselves. And, you know, this mental boundary of establishing the hours that we work and sticking to that is really important. Again, you know, using time to advise management on strategies for more efficient meetings if you happen to come across something where you think, do you know what, there are alternatives to this. And then another one is not gossiping with colleagues at work. And, you know, this is very different to connecting and spending time with colleagues, but this is again more about those depleting activities that drain us and get us whipped up into a frenzy. When we take time to notice perhaps some of what's happening as a result of doing those kind of activities and choose to step out of them, that can actually be really quite liberating. So the other huge area really where there is an endless amount of work for us, well, certainly personally, to do is what I would refer to as our information technology boundaries. And, you know, this is how we are pretty much plugged in to the 24/7 culture now. It is really easy, particularly if we have slow work computers or IT issues at work or old work mobiles, to download work apps onto our personal devices. And I'm guilty of this, and, you know, as Sam will adhere to, I wouldn't have been able to present one of my workshops a few weeks ago if I hadn't have put Teams on my iPad. But actually, I really don't advocate it. I think if we have got access to our emails and work apps on our personal devices, one of the healthiest things we can all do after this workshop is delete them, because it just makes it so much harder to be boundaried and enforce those strict time limits on when we're accessing work. On my work phone now, I have set the focus mode, which is the silent mode. So if I do ever forget to turn my work phone off on the time I finish, my calls are automatically silenced. And to be honest, I also have this focus mode on my personal mobile, because, you know, 20 years ago, nobody would be able to contact me, or certainly wouldn't be phoning me after 9 o'clock at night. So I can't receive any email alerts, personal or telephone calls after a certain time at night. And this just protects that home life a little more. When we are on annual leave or we're off sick, then put your work mobiles and laptops completely away. I mean, again, you know, I know people that are off sick and are replying to work emails because, again, it's on their personal phones. And if we're unfit for work, then we need that time to rest and recuperate. And I think, like anything, if we can see it, it is much, much harder for us not to engage in it. So that's what we want to be doing. Don't give out your mobile phone number inappropriately, and by that I particularly to service users. I know there are some services where that's part of the protocol for the service, and that's absolutely fine. But certainly I've worked with a lot of service providers who have given out mobile phone numbers in an emergency situation, and then they have ended up having to change their mobile phone number because they've not been able to stop individuals once they have that number from using it. And do use your out of office notifications, and once it's on, you don't have to look at the notifications again until you return. And I certainly advocate doing as many of the boundaries in terms of physical, mental, emotional, and IT boundaries when we are at home, more importantly, really, because our homes are our sanctuaries. These are where we have the connections with people that are in our personal lives. It's where we have time with ourselves. It's where we recharge our batteries. And if possible, it's essential we find a way to leave work at work, because if we don't, then we are really increasing our risk of burnout and having a real negative impact on our home and personal lives. Now, I'm very aware, again, myself included, that during the pandemic, there's been a significant increase in home working. And so I've noticed it's much, much harder for me now when I'm working from home to feel as though I've finished work when I finish work. So some of the things that we can do if we're working from home is making sure that we tidy up our workspace completely. So again, fully closing down the laptops, switch off, shut down, put away, switch off phones. And when we can't see it, we're sending a really, really strong message to ourselves that this is now our home life. This is time to be away from work. And if you do find yourself working from home, then I think it's really important to have some home working boundaries. And, you know, for some people, what the pandemic has allowed, if working from home, is a lot more time in the morning. And so people have, certainly people I know, have been setting their alarms much later and pretty much getting up 10 minutes before they need to be at their desk, and then sitting at their desk with their cameras off, with their breakfast, you know, in their pajamas. Now, as comfortable as that may be, again, it starts to really, really blur the boundary between your home and personal life. So if you can, I would really recommend getting up at your usual time, even if you're working from home, and continue to undertake the routines that signify the end and the start of your normal working day. So for me, this will be getting up, going for a walk, having a shower, putting my work clothes on, sitting at my desk, and then to signify the end of the working day, that would be very much changing out of my work clothes. And if I am working from home, then I try and ensure that I have another, even if it's 10-minute walk, just away from the desk, to signify that this is now the end of the work time. I'm just waiting for the slides to catch up. Thank you. And yeah, and I think it's really important when you're working from home as well, and and when you're working in the office, but hopefully you'd be at home, not to check emails and messages when you're not scheduled to be at work. So again, I know I have individuals in the team who are due to start work at 9 o'clock, yet their emails have been checked at 7:15, you know, and it's that leakage into our own time, and it really disintegrates the sense that home is separate from work. So yeah, I just cannot emphasize it enough. They should be two separate things. And if possible, if you are working from home, if you can have one space where you choose in your home as the working from home location. I mean, ideally, I would say never in your bedroom if that's avoidable, you know, but if there can always be at a particular table or at a particular chair, because again, otherwise you're allowing work to sort of permeate into a whole host of different rooms. And if you have a particularly stressful meeting or something happens at work that's not very nice, and you've had that in the living room, and then the next day you've sat in the kitchen and you have another bad meeting, then those are the kind of sort of situations that can trigger those thoughts and memories on a different day. So this dedicated space can be really helpful. And if you are working from home, or if you find yourself leaving later when you're in the office, ward, whatever, then maybe set a start and finish alarm to prompt you to get up and leave when you have finished your working hours. Research is increasingly finding that people who are working from home are actually putting in more and more hours. Although recently, quite a large study has found that employers think that people working from home actually are not working anywhere near as hard as people in the office. So, you know, this is still quite an early area of research. So I just very quickly want to go through just some of the key strategies in terms of allowing you to make your boundary setting a little easier. So in terms of communication, communicating clearly is really going to reduce the risk of misunderstanding. And when we are setting boundaries, we do want these conversations to be very direct. And direct doesn't necessarily mean confrontational or rude or abrupt. It means clear and precise. So communicating will really reduce the risk of this misunderstanding, and we need to ensure that we've communicated to those who need to know as well. So for example, it's not very helpful saying to our colleagues, you know, I will not tolerate A, B and C from my manager anymore, and then not telling your manager. That's not really putting a boundary in. Just if we can have the communicate. Lovely, thank you, Sam. Avoiding assumptions. So a lot of us assume that the people around us have got a greater insight into our own needs than they usually have. So if uncertain, ask questions for clarity. It's much easier to clear up a misunderstanding if we have that discussion within the initial context of a conversation. There might be times when somebody's asked us to do something, we're like, oh, I'm not really sure what we're saying yes to, but I'll say yes and then I'll email later. And that's when you discover that you've signed up to a lot more than you thought you had, but you've already said yes. So certainly get that clarity and try as much as you can to only say yes when you mean it, because this enforces boundaries but also helps us build our personal integrity, and it helps others understand that when we say something that they can trust us because our words actually more accurately represent our thoughts. You know, because again, do we want to be saying yes a lot and then 24 hours later going, oh no, I didn't mean yes? You know, if we can learn and have the confidence to be able to direct our conversations with clarity and be open and honest about our needs in the moment, that's going to be much more helpful. And you know, and this ties in with responding in real time, you know, because holding on to stuff actually just makes it more complicated. So if we respond to a specific request in the moment, it can help direct future interactions, but also it can help the development of a more professional and trusting work culture. Because if we address something as it comes up, then this enforces to the other person, you know, that we've got the time and effort in that moment, and it can validate that exchange. It also demonstrates that we're confident in our message. If we're like, oh, actually, we can reply to this now, or give me 5 to think it through, rather than going away and ruminating and trying to work out how we're going to say what we actually wanted to say. But no matter how much we put boundaries in place, and no matter how well we communicate and when we respond in real time, there are going to be times when we have to respond to a boundary crossing, because people push boundaries, we all push boundaries. One of the reasons from a therapeutic point of view we talk about boundary pushing is we want to know it's safe. So we give it a little shove to see if it's held. So it can be really, really helpful to know how you're going to respond if a boundary is challenged, and just something personable like, oh, I'm really sorry, but that doesn't work for me. Or, you know, I'm not going to be able to make that deadline. What's the alternative? You know, this can really help us prevent being caught off guard. But it does allow time for thinking and for the situation to be resolved. You know, it's about having a respectful dialogue, which you know, on the next slide, very much being respectful should underpin all of our dialogue, whether it's about boundaries or not. And I think there is often a perception that if you're a boundaried individual, that this is strict or punitive. But actually, in contrast, boundaries are all about respect. They are about respect for ourselves and ensuring that we're getting what we need, but also respect for others, so others know what to expect from us. You know, boundaries are this clear and unambiguous way of communicating our needs, and you know, and as such, it should actually enhance how we're able to have dialogue without the need for anger and sarcasm and criticisms, which, to be honest, very rarely achieve anything other than distress. So one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about boundaries today is that I think now more than ever, and no more than ever, is saying no can be really, really hard, and we can feel guilty, particularly in a lot of the roles we have now. If we say no to something, we know there isn't necessarily someone else to pick that up. But when we are saying no, it highlights areas which are understaffed or that we might need support with. And if we are able to say no, then we can focus on what we can, and we can do that well, and hopefully that will prevent us from becoming overwhelmed. You know, there is a whole host of different ways of working now as a result of the pandemic. Lots of our job roles have changed and morphed, and whilst it feels very difficult, you know, these changes are creating a really perfect opportunity for us to kind of think, well, hold up, you know, what do I need to implement here in terms of boundaries going forward? and we want to do that before we all become, very drained and burnt out. So, now more than ever, try creating routines where you can wind down and draw a line under work. And if you're caring for others and find yourself worrying, things like watching the news and being on social media can be hugely triggering. As much as you can, try and unplug from all of that, because it's, no matter how much control we think we have over what we follow on social media, there is so much out there that I don't sign up to see, that I'm bombarded with. And as part of your boundary setting, set yourself space to do the things that you enjoy and do things that are restorative, because we can't pour from an empty cup. So we really, really do need to self-care. And there are a whole host of webinars out there that Sam can direct you to on lots of good practices of self-care. And I just wanted to finish really with this quote from Bailey in 2022 on the next page. And they highlight that there are certain jobs in which eye-wateringly long days are just now seen as par for the course. And these include healthcare. There's an assumption that staff are passionate enough to happily stay late or take on extra tasks. And according to an NHS survey done in January of this year, 3/4 of healthcare staff said they took on extra unpaid hours because of the pressure to do so out of commitment or goodwill. And that's, when we look at the issues that we're having in retention and recruitment and increasing mental health issues, that's really worrying. 3/4 of staff are doing unpaid extra work. And so I think now is the time more than ever to be putting these boundaries in.